Hello, I am Sarah Colson, the 22nd Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the owner and governing body since 1858 of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and more recently, the George Washington Library. It is my privilege to welcome you today to Leadership for a More Perfect Union, a virtual symposium hosted in partnership with the Brookings Institution and the George Washington Library of Mount Vernon. We are informed that George Washington believed deeply in the need for all citizens to be engaged in their communities and in the process of governing. The current challenges that our nation faces, particularly the devastating pandemic and the recent assaults on the institutions of our democracy, have underscored how essential it is that all facets of society are able to work together to meet a common goal. As Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and as the leader of the Continental Congress during the creation of our Constitution, and as the first President of the United States, George Washington perhaps understood more so than any other individual how crucial it was that Americans remain united in the face of challenges, large and small. Inspired by George Washington's example and selfless dedication to public service, today the Brookings Institution and Mount Vernon have partnered to organize this symposium that brings together many of our country's leading government, civic, and business leaders to explore how to navigate the great challenges we are facing. What better time now that our nation has again witnessed a peaceful transfer of government, as it has since President George Washington bid farewell and walked away from power for the last time, to discuss the kinds of leadership we need going forward. This symposium will explore the traits of effective leadership in times of change and in times of crisis. Since the 1850s, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has been committed to preserving our nation's past, both physically and intellectually, so that it endures to inform and inspire future generations. The lessons of history that speak to us so powerfully from a place like Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, are indeed timeless and vital. Although regrettably we can't gather in person at Mount Vernon for this conference, I invite you to visit and experience the beloved home for George Washington, which he enjoyed throughout his life and was the place of so many of his important decisions. As we proceed, I would like to especially thank General John Allen, President and CEO of the Brookings Institution, for his leadership and commitment to this symposium, and that of Doug Bradburn, President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and David Rubenstein, co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group and noted patriotic philanthropist, as well as the esteemed group of speakers who believe this conversation is sufficiently important to give of their time and their reflection. On behalf of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, we hope you enjoy this symposium. As always, thank you for your participation and your support.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Colson, for this very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As mentioned, my name is John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and it's my great pleasure to be the first to welcome you to this conference entitled Leadership for a More Perfect Union. The Brookings Institution is a nonpartisan public policy think tank that performs independent, fact-based research. Every day, our dedicated scholars and staff spend their time researching the most pressing policy questions that we face to help inform leaders across the society on how to improve the lives of our fellow citizens, both inside the United States and around the world. So today's conference, which is a partnership between the Brookings Institution and George Washington's Mount Vernon, could not be more timely. Last week, President Joseph R. Biden Jr. took the oath of office to become the 46th President of the United States, swearing to, quote, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, unquote. And President Biden became the latest holder of America's highest office in the land, and one that has a unique lineage that began with President George Washington in 1789. Entrusted to lead our nation, President Washington set the example of leadership for us in the earliest days of the Republic. That example, one that was embodied the greatest ideals of integrity and public service, is the foundation for the conference today. Although this foundation comes to us from across more than 2 centuries, the conference is intended to look to the future and give voice to the type of leadership the United States as a country and America as a people will need to confront the challenges of the 21st century. For indeed, it has been an American leadership and our shared and cherished values that have seen the United States through the most difficult moments of our nation's history. During times of enormous social, economic, and security challenges, the character of America has been what has brought out our very best. And even today, where our frontline workers and medical professionals continue to give their all in support of a healthier and more prosperous future, we see how leadership and character are what will ultimately allow us to overcome the many unknowns that we will face in this century. That is why, as an institution long dedicated to supporting the public good, we at the Brookings Institution are thrilled to partner with George Washington's Mount Vernon, which similarly seeks to educate and inspire its many visitors through the lens of President Washington's selfless devotion to the nation. With that, let me please turn the floor over to Mount Vernon's President and CEO, Doug Bradburn. Doug, the floor is yours, and thank you for this wonderful partnership.
Thank you, General Allen, for that wonderful introduction. I also am excited to partner with the Brookings Institution to look at the challenges of leadership in our time together. Again, I'm Doug Bradburn, President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Welcome to this extraordinary place. Now, our democracy is strong, but I think all of us can do a better job in nurturing it and making sure that it will survive. George Washington always thought of it as a great experiment. In fact, the last great experiment in human happiness under civil society. And he helped launch us on this shared journey together to try to see if a free people could govern themselves with justice and with peace as the main goals. Now, George Washington was an extraordinary leader, and we still can draw on him as we face the challenges of our present and our future together. In fact, I like to reflect on his first moments as president, the invention of that incredible office. As he wrote at the time, "I walk on untrodden ground. Everything I do is subject to 2 interpretations. Everything I do is making a precedent." Washington understood that what he did would shape the future, just like we need to understand that our choices shape our future together and future generations. Washington's vision was one of his extraordinary qualities, and I think you'll see as we see conversations with great leaders today that one of the aspects that they share is that long-term vision, not to be distracted by the daily 24-hour news cycle, but rather think about what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to reach together. On the other side of the spectrum is a small note about Washington, was his extraordinary humility. In fact, when he wrote about the challenges that he faced, he recognized that leadership in his time to create a government that was both of laws and accommodation sometimes needed conciliation, sometimes prudence, and sometimes firmness. There's no one simple path to solve any given problem, but that's the art of leadership that Washington gave us and that we can continue to learn from. His humility was not passivity. It was a willingness to recognize that he needed to listen to others, but once decisions were made, to act with firmness. So he used humility with strength in a way to solve major problems with his eyes on a long-term vision. Those are 2 aspects of Washington's leadership, I think, that we still can draw on. And I think we'll all see more in these incredible conversations with extraordinary leaders who have not only successfully led in crisis, they've also found ways to cross the partisan divide that sometimes seems like it's too great for us to reach across. But the fact is we have to work together to solve the problems that we're facing going forward. Social justice issues, economic challenges, foreign policy challenges, health crisis that we're in the midst of. All these will require remarkable leadership. And so it's in that spirit that we come together to ask questions. How can we all do a better job in leading to a more prosperous future. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Doug Bradburn, President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I'm joined here for this conversation with Governor Larry Hogan. Governor, welcome to Mount Vernon remotely.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I'm sorry we're not there in person, but I'm glad to be with you virtually.
Well, we'll get that done. I don't know if you can see behind my ear. There's a picture where you can see Maryland, actually, right over the river
see.
there.
It's beautiful there on the other side of the Potomac.
So we love Maryland. It's in our view, as we say, and of course you own all the water that comes right up to the estate here.
Well, we're happy to let you use it, though, all you Virginians.
Now, you have a wonderful connection to George Washington at the beautiful State House there. Talk a little bit about where you see him in a daily way.
Well, sure. It's terrific. In the room that I'm sitting in, and this is the oldest continually operated State House in America. This was the first peacetime capital of the United States after the end of the Revolutionary War. And I'm in the governor's reception room here talking with you, but in the room just below me is the old Senate chamber, which we recently, a couple of years ago, restored back to its original condition. It's where George Washington resigned as the commanding general of the Continental Forces. And it's where we ratified the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. So we've got a beautiful historic room down there. It's not quite Mount Vernon, but George Washington spent a lot of time here in Annapolis with the rest of the founding fathers. And we've got a great tribute and a great statue of him in the room right below me.
You know, we're in such an interesting time right now in our country's history, but that room is so important. I mean, could you speak to, what do you think that resignation, how important was his resignation of giving up military authority at the end of the war to the history of this country?
Well, I talked about this the other day after the events in Washington, the attack, the insurrection on the Capitol, and I was down in our rotunda, just outside of the room, right next to George Washington's original resignation speech and the statue of George Washington in the room where he resigned. And I said, he really, it was the first time in human history that a conquering general turned over in a peaceful way his power to a government yet to be formed. We didn't have the Constitution, but that's set in precedent for the remainder of our democratic republic, the way we've always done it with every change of administrations until the events of last weekend. So I get to see the history of George Washington every day, almost like you do, really home with me about this was an incredible thing that he accomplished here. That is so meaningful to us as a country, and it was just I was giving my speech about what was happening in Washington. Right out, Washington gave his speech for the first transition of power.
Well, I'm glad that powerful continuity spoke to you. I mean, we do sometimes take for granted these traditions of democracy that we've nurtured for so long, and we can see how quickly norms can be violated and things can go off the rails. So,
well, no question. It really struck me. In fact, I got emotional as I was talking about it because of how important it was to the country and our entire legacy since Washington.
Well, so one of the things that Washington's also known for, of course, is his encouragement of really nonpartisan thinking about country first and service and trying to figure out a way to work together. You've really made a career out of being a bipartisan leader in a state that's, traditionally thought of as heavily Democratic, a Republican governor there. How do you do that? I mean, how do you work with all sides in a way that we see not working, at the national level right now, or not always working in other places?
Well, Washington was perhaps, the one I remember most from history who really did espouse those things as our first president who focused on, bipartisanship. I think in his in his last speech, where his farewell address, I think he talks about the fact that there's too much partisanship, and he was concerned for the nation. It's something I've always been passionate about. When I first took office, I was elected in 2014. My first inaugural address here at this historic State House, I said that I wanted to end the bitter partisanship that we had seen in Washington, and we didn't want to see it happen here in our state capitol. I pledged to try to advance the best ideas, regardless of which side of the aisle they came from. And I said my main goal was to usher in a new era of bipartisan cooperation, where the best ideas can rise to the top, that we can reach across the aisle and come up with common sense bipartisan solutions. And it's what I've been focused on ever since, for the past 6 years. I'm now about to have my third president. But my position changed. I work, I'm in the highest Democratic registration state in America, and I was overwhelmingly elected by Republicans, Democrats, and independents, because it turns out it's really what most Americans want: people to work together and solve the problems without the divisive and angry rhetoric. And now I'm chairing a group called No Labels, which is made up of Democrats and Republicans working together to try to accomplish those things in Washington and across the country.
Well, yeah, I like the work the No Labels group does. I know that they've often used the symbol of George Washington too in their work, because I guess he's the only president that didn't have a label on him. So this the bipartisan relationships, you've done it. You've certainly done it. The question is, it's how do we get more of that, in our leadership? Is it really come down to leadership choice? There's structural challenges. It's difficult for folks, and it's easy to say we should govern in a more bipartisan manner, but it's clearly not easy to do. So what are some things you think that have worked in the state that you could see other places being more useful?
Well, I think this is something, while it's certainly grown exponentially in the past couple of years, it really has been heading in that direction for a couple of decades, continually getting worse. It was accelerated by social media and kind of tribalism and warring camps and people listening in echo chambers. It's further perpetuated by gerrymandering and districts that aren't competitive. And but we've gotten to a place. It used to be you could passionately argue for your side of an issue, something you really cared about, while not demeaning or denigrating the people who disagreed with you. And that's what I tried to do here in Maryland. It's not that I don't have agreements. My legislature is 7% Democratic majorities in both houses. We don't always agree, but I try to not to disagree and be disagreeable. I don't try to, I think it's the name calling, the personal attacks, the inflamed rhetoric is a huge problem. But we've found ways to be successful and find that middle ground where people can stand together. Like we came together with Democrats here on access to healthcare, affordability of healthcare, groundbreaking criminal justice reform, on expanding education opportunities, protecting the environment. Most people in America really do want their elected leaders to work together and to come up with common sense bipartisan solutions and just solve the problems. They hate the divisive rhetoric. There are people on the far right and the far left very angry, yelling at each other, but most people are really fed up with that type of politics.
Yeah, and most people, don't want to talk about the horse races all day long, every day. We want policies that are, done and achieved. And you all have done some great work there. I want to quote this poll, 2020. So just in January now. Maybe this has all changed after this crazy pandemic, which I want to talk about. But the 73% of Democrats, 77% of Republicans, and 78% of independents in Maryland give you a high approval rating as governor. That is, it was quoted as extraordinary and protein-like appeal that you have. That is really remarkable. How can you bottle that essence and get it out there? Because being popular at that level for all these different groups in the climate we've been in is really extraordinary. What's the key to your popularity?
Yeah, thank you. And it's not exactly popularity, because it's not do you like the governor? It's job approval rating. So they approve of the job that we've been able to do. It is a different metric, but it is number one in the country. But there are other governors doing the same thing. So a couple of my colleagues, Charlie Baker and Phil Scott, who are Republican governors in very Democratic states. They're also really, very high approval ratings. And I think it goes back to what I was talking about, in the previous answer. What Democrats, Republicans, and independents want is effective bipartisan leadership and common sense solutions. What they don't want is the kind of inflamed politics that we see really on both sides. And that's why the numbers are so shocking and different. It's almost the opposite of what we see in Washington. I think, Jeb Bush called me the antithesis to what was going on in Washington. But it's what most people want. It doesn't have anything to do with I'm a nice guy or what's the secret sauce or the magic. It's pretty simple. It's what America wants. And they want people to come together. It's what I did as chairman of the National Governors Association for a year during the pandemic, when all the governors were on the front lines, and we stepped up. And I really tried to represent the interest of every governor from blue states and red states, and fight for the things that we needed for the people of our states.
Well, I want to talk about that leadership and that work, because this year was really a great challenge, obviously, but there's also a real re-education of the American people that we're actually a federal union, and that states have things that they can do that the national government can't do, and states have a particular role to play. And now we experienced this pandemic and the need for a pandemic response, which required this federal relationship. In what ways do you think this country, was successful in that challenge? In what ways do we still have some work to do? Because it really did bring the governors to the fore in a way that, typically only people in those states see. We've had state governors becoming celebrities all of a sudden this year, some of them even writing leadership books before the pandemic's over. So, what do you think worked about our system, and what do we still need to do better in this response in the governor-federal relationship?
Well, every poll would tell you that the governors have always been the ones by far with the highest approval ratings, because they approve of the job that their chief executives are doing in their states multiple times higher than anyone in Washington. So it's not a new thing. We did get more attention and focus by the national media. So because we were actually on the front lines leading during the pandemic, and I was honored to have been, elected unanimously by my colleagues to be the chairman of all the nation's governors and the National Governors Association prior to the pandemic hitting. And then when that hit, I led 50 some calls of all the governors in America with the White House, with the president, vice president, coronavirus task force. We pushed for testing and PPE and utilization of the Defense Production Act, and people across America saw the governors on the front line stepping in and leading at a time where they thought there was vacuum, where things weren't happening at the federal level. So absolutely, this pandemic and the response really showed a different side of federalism and the role of the state versus the federal government. There were things we needed the federal government to do and that we were pushing for them to do. But we were on the front lines and the ones that were able to provide these things to the people in our states. And so there was a much more of a need for federal and state cooperation. And I'm a states' rights guy, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have taken on the lion's share of the effort, but there's certain things only the federal government can do. Ramping up the production of these things on a national and international basis and acquiring things. We had 50 states, competing with each other and the federal government and other countries to get desperately needed supplies. We needed to save lives. So it was I think we're going to do an after action report and see where all the government at all levels succeeded, where it failed, and what we can improve moving forward.
Yeah. Do you see structural problems that need some clarity, or do you see leadership problems that really exacerbated ambiguities in the federal-state relationship?
Well, I'll say I think there was a little bit of both. But to give credit to the administration, which I was pretty critical of, probably more so than any Republican, and on behalf of all the governors, I was the one that had to sometimes push back in some of these calls that we were leading. But on the good side, I want to give a shout out to Vice President Pence, who really did an unbelievable job of communicating with the governors. I mean, we had more video conferences on an almost weekly basis with all the leaders of the federal government than we've had in the past 50 years. We had them in 9 months. So there was an effort to work together. Some of it was terrible messaging on the part of the president and not following the advice of his own public health experts, but they were providing us with good guidance and expertise. And we were all of us at every level had to work together. We had to find a way to stop this deadly virus and keep people alive and keep them safe and keep our livelihoods, people able to maintain their jobs and their small businesses.
And so I guess finally on this question, we're not obviously out of this pandemic as we're speaking. We've got the vaccination efforts are, exciting for those of us waiting to be vaccinated, but you're in the thick of it. And, how complicated has it been and how well is it going in Maryland right now from your perspective?
Well, it's pretty complicated. This is the largest peacetime undertaking that the United States has ever had. So in our relatively small state of Maryland, we need 12 million vaccines. We have about 500,000 of them. We've deployed and distributed 99.6% of them to all of the people who need to do the vaccines. And in our phase 1A, which is hospitals and nursing homes and frontline healthcare workers, first responders and those groups we're at the top of the pyramid, but we're a long way from getting the entire population. The Operation Warp Speed has been a big success in that they're years ahead of schedule discovering a vaccine. But the production and the setting up of this massive infrastructure without money, with depleted local health departments and hospitals that are overwhelmed treating patients that don't have time to vaccinate their own workers. It's we're calling up the National Guard. We're doing at this point as of today. We're better than 32 other states, but it's by far not acceptable. I'm not going to be happy until every single person that wants one can get a vaccine, and that's the only way we're going to get a return to normalcy and get our kids back in school and get our businesses fully open and get people back to their previous lives. And unless we can get this thing moving faster, we're not going to do it.
Well, good luck with that, and keep up the good work as well. I want to ask you, here at Mount Vernon, we often teach about leadership and bring leaders together from across the country, across the world, and to think about ways we could become better leaders together, drawing on examples of the past as well as mentors and other things. What are some of the principles of leadership you would share to a rising a leader at, either in the private sector or in government, academia, whatever, in politics? Who have you learned from, either in history or in your own life, that some lessons you think are really transferable that can be approached?
Well, perhaps there's no greater leader than George Washington, and some of the things that he focused on are the things that I think anybody that studies history ought to look at what Washington and Lincoln and some of these other great leaders of our country focus on. But look, we're in a truly unprecedented crisis, and I think the most important qualities you've got to have collaboration. You've got the best advice you possibly can from the people that have the expertise. Gather that information, but not to hesitate, to be decisive, to make important, tough decisions regardless of the consequences, and then to communicate clearly and consistently to the public about why we're taking these actions and why it's important for us to do them and how we arrived at them. And I think transparency, decisiveness, clear communication, and taking action. A lot of people spend too much time trying to figure out and debate in an emergency, in a crisis where lives were at stake. We had to make hundreds of decisions very quickly. So you had to have smart people around you and listen to them and then communicate those decisions.
You put your finger on a really essential element too, I think, of Washington's success, and in your own reflection, how do you balance, on the one hand, the humility to listen, right, to know that you need advice, you need to have a time to get some judgment, with not being passive, where you have to make decisive decisions and you got to push them through, and that was the judgment, the balance and judgment that he was known for in his time. And it sounds like you really touched on that nicely by emphasizing the need to put the right people in place, so you can listen to good advice, so that even if it's a crisis where you have to act fast, you can do that in a kind of a humble way, but decisively.
I think that Washington was the perfect example of integrity, of being humble. I mentioned earlier about his resignation here, where, he, instead of standing in front of the room in our old Senate chamber, he stood in the back of them and out to the Continental Congress, showing respect, even though he was the great leader that many people thought, should be the king. But he was an extremely humble man who did, I think, listen to the advice of others, and who tried to make great decisions, and who was not afraid to take decisive action. So he's the perfect example for it. But this pandemic has made a lot of people step up, and it's serving the people of my state has been the greatest honor of my lifetime. It comes with an enormous amount of responsibility, and I think when you're serving in any leadership role, there's going to be times when your strength, your will, and your character are going to be tested. But it's important to stay grounded, stay true to who you are, to always act with honor, and to try to find compromise without abandoning your principles. And I think that's what we're lacking. The moral courage. There's some people that are too busy playing politics. Frankly, you were asking earlier about how do I have this approval of all these people. It's by not caring about that approval, by just telling it like it is, by making the decisions, and not just playing politics all the time. And it turns out that's what everybody wants.
Well, that's great to hear. I think I'll close, on a reflection, if I could, from you. I mean, a lot of great moments in American history, crises. We think of wars a lot of times, and we're in a crisis now. The reality is it's revealed a lot of problems as much as anything, and we're going to need great leadership moving forward. Once this thing is over, it's not over, because we have to figure out what kind of society we need to be to be successful. So I think about after the American Revolution, the real leadership challenge was the creation of the Constitution. That was the need to come together and solve problems that were revealed after independence was actually fought. And like the Marshall Plan after World War II is a tremendous leadership to sort of fix Europe so that we wouldn't have another war like the World War II. And so, what do you see as the big challenges facing us as leaders, and how do we talk about how, but just reflect a minute on what you think's coming in the next few years here.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We're at a major turning point in America, and this isn't the end of a crisis. We're still right in the throes of the crisis, and it is going to take leaders. It is going to take leaders that have the courage to stand up and do and say things that may not be popular with their base. And people are going to have to not look at Twitter likes or poll numbers, and just do the things that they believe are right for the country. I learned, besides the leaders we're talking about from early in our history. And by the way, I spoke at the Reagan Institute right after the election and said, that it's a time. Reagan said it's a time for choosing, and that we have to decide what direction we're going to go as a nation. And in order to look forward, I think we should look back at some of the leadership of those who came before us and the challenges that they had. But I learned a great deal about leadership from my dad, who was. He put the country before his party in his own career by being the first Republican to vote for the impeachment of President Nixon on the Judiciary Committee.
He was a Maryland congressman, is that right?
Maryland congressman. Nixon made the decision to resign the presidency after his speech on the Judiciary Committee. And look, I learned a lot about integrity and making tough decisions. And I just think most Americans want to see, we have differences, but I think there's far more that unites us than divides us. And I think that people want the elected leaders to focus on issues that impact their daily lives and delivering real solutions. And they want to end to this angry, divisive politics. And, I just believe that we're going to need some people to step up and be willing to tell it like it is, and to try to move on from where we are. We can't stay where we are as a nation. I mean, it's really a turning point for America.
I think that's it. The status quo is not good enough. And thank you so much, Governor, for this conversation and for your leadership and your advice. I mean, for all those people who say, well, it's naive to constantly emphasize bipartisanship, you've clearly shown it can work, and it does work, and the people approve it, and it's where we need, and it's the only way we're going to solve big problems. So.
Well, if we can accomplish that here as a Republican in the bluest state in America, there's no place that it's not going to be successful. I can tell you that.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time and this wonderful contribution to our conversation. And I wish you the best of luck with the challenges ahead. And
thank you so much for
you've got
having
a friend at Mount Vernon and George Washington. Come see us once the pandemic's over.
Well, thank you. And come back to see George Washington here in our old Senate chamber, too. We'll exchange some notes.
He got around. All right. Well, that's great. So thank you so much and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're really fortunate this afternoon to have Congresswoman Jane Harman, who served in the Congress as a member of the House of Representatives for 9 terms, joining us. Among her many accomplishments while in Congress, she served 6 years on armed services, 8 years on intelligence, and 8 years on homeland security. During her long and very distinguished public career, Congresswoman Harman has been recognized as a national expert at the nexus of security and public policy issues. Congresswoman Harman is a trustee of the Aspen Institute, an honorary trustee of the University of Southern California, and is a member of the Presidential Debates Commission. She is a magna cum laude graduate of Smith College and Harvard Law School. For the last decade, she has very ably led the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and as its first female director and president and CEO, she has performed magnificently in leading the process of policy development at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. We're so grateful that she could take her time today to join us to speak about global collaboration and America's leadership as we move forward into the 21st century. So Congresswoman Harman, Jane, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Delighted to be here.
Jane, what I would like to do, because our time is limited, and if you have comments, you can make them at the beginning, is to pose the first question, if I may. The times of George Washington were naturally very difficult, and as you have known, he greatly feared that America was becoming too entangled in foreign alliances. At the same time, anything resembling true isolation is all but impossible for us today. And with that in mind, how do we find the right balance between collaborating globally and taking care of America's sovereign and domestic interests?
Well, if I may, let me say first that I'm delighted to participate with you in this very interesting conference, saluting the leadership, I think, of George Washington, our first president, who understood how to lead the presidency and how to leave the presidency. Very important lesson. And I also want to salute your leadership. We overlapped, my political terms in Congress overlapped your leadership in the military, at CENTCOM, and also as commander of ISAF, and we've been dear friends in the think tank world. And John Allen, I won't let you cut this out of the interview. You and Kathy are very cherished friends of mine, so I'm happy to be here. On this issue of how do we balance international commitments and domestic commitments, I have to say I hate the word balance. I don't think this is a balance. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I have been saying for 2 decades that security and liberty need to be protected at the same time. That's what Ben Franklin said, and he's even older than I am. So I think that the incoming Biden administration has the right frame. In order to be strong globally, we have to be strong at home. And I think the challenge now is to make us stronger in both places.
Well, this is a moment where American strength and American leadership is going to be imperative to the 21st century and to our friends overseas, and to those who would wish us ill. And so it's very important, as you have well put. So clearly, we face a number of issues that have global implications: the environment, a global pandemic, immigration, a plethora of international security issues, just to name a few. I mean, this is a long list, but a few of them here. What, in your view, is the right role for the U.S. to play as we move forward in the 21st century in the context of leadership on the international stage?
Well, let me say first that the last president I can think of who really articulated a strategy for the U.S. role in the world, whether we agree with it or not, was Ronald Reagan. And since then, we have had interesting presidents in both parties who have, by my lights, been more tactical than strategic about foreign policy. And I'm sure you're going to ask me more about this, but my basic comment here is that the Biden administration needs to articulate a strategy for U.S. leadership. And here's my suggestion. A dear friend of mine, whom I've known since we were staffers in the Senate, imagine that, is Madeleine Albright. And she, for years, called America the indispensable nation. Every time she said that, I said, wait a minute, Madeleine, America is the indispensable partner. And my idea about what to do is to restore our alliances, build some new friendships, and with them articulate a strategy for a free and peaceful world.
Well, you've touched an important issue about whether the United States is a partner, has been a partner, and will be a reliable partner in the future. But let me ask about, on balance, as you look at the international response, for example, to the pandemic, what are some of the key lessons learned from the international collaboration that we might have undertaken or that we ought to undertake as we move forward? And given the uniquely multifaceted nature of America and in its many regions and cultures, what have we learned about ourselves that we can apply to the lessons that we could extend to our friends overseas and our allies?
Well, the saddest thing, John, is we have to learn from others at this point how to manage the pandemic. Our teachers are New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea. How did that happen? We're the country, oh, by the way, I think in the George W. Bush administration, or maybe early Obama, who staged a logistics effort into Africa to deal with the Ebola epidemic and prevent it from coming to America. We know how to do these things. In this case, it's not all our fault. I think there is very credible evidence that the Chinese misled, covered up the nature and lethality of this epidemic. I think that's on them. But then we imagined that everything would be fun and easy and no problem, and we'd only have 10 cases. And we failed to use the tools we have. We have had at least 4 or 5 pandemics, or at least epidemics, something like this in the United States. And there is a toolkit to use. We didn't deploy it. The Defense Production Act is probably the best tool, which was never fully deployed, which could organize and order the United States and all of our public and private sector facilities to manage this problem. We didn't do testing, we didn't do tracing, and now we're not doing effective distribution of 2 different vaccines, both of which are 90% effective. So what do we do now? As indispensable partner in the world, we restore our membership in the World Health Organization, and we launch, with capable people at the helm in the Biden administration, a worldwide effort to finally get this under control. And why worldwide? We have urgent needs in our country, which is just about at the bottom of the bottom in terms of dealing with this. I say we won't get our own country under control if we don't help the world get under control. But I also say that the best thing we could do in terms of reestablishing America's moral and actual leadership in the world is to help the world recover from this.
Marvelous. And you touched on a matter which is really going to be central to the role of America going forward, the leadership role, not just with our friends and allies, but the leadership role as it has to be perceived by those who may be our opponents or our competitors.
Right.
Let's talk about China for a moment, because you touched on that a moment ago. And so for many years, this idea of the West was an organizational construct that helped us to compete against and to help stand off against the Soviet Union, which is really a nuclear existential threat to everything that we stood for. Now, do we face a sort of Cold War with China today? And And if not, is conflict inevitable, as Graham Allison in the concept of the Thucydides trap has suggested? Or can we instead find our way forward through American leadership again to a more cooperative relationship with the Chinese, defined by honest competition, but by outcompeting, as opposed to being in perennial confrontation or the attempt to contain the Chinese? What, Jane, as you think about leadership in the 21st century on behalf of the United States and America, what should that look like as it relates to the China relationship?
Well, you started with the Cold War, which we won. Let's understand that.
Yes, we did.
Ronald Reagan was president, and he handed off the presidency seat peacefully to George H.W. Bush, who basically concluded it. We won the Cold War. We then made a bunch of mistakes, and that has to do with China. We won the Cold War, and we thought we were the unipolar power in the world forever and ever. And we missed China's rise. We missed it. And we thought that if China rose, China would want to be us. Well, guess what? China doesn't want to be us. And China is a very able competitor to us. And China may actually, in terms of all the stats, exceed us in some near term. And this may end up being the Asian secretary. It's the Asian century. So let's get over ourselves. Now what? What you've suggested is right. China is both a competitor and a country that we can cooperate with. We've got to sort this out. China has done some things that are really wrong, and we should call China on these things. And I salute the Trump administration for identifying intellectual property theft, not being tough enough on the abuse of human rights in Hong Kong and against the Uyghurs, but they got it right that China's doing bad stuff. They got it wrong in terms of a strategy for curbing bad stuff and promoting good stuff. And so the opportunities are pretty broad, I think. One of them is climate. You've mentioned climate. You can't solve climate by building national borders. Climate is an international problem. China and we are the big polluters. So we need to work with China, which we had started to do in the Obama administration, and which we will continue to do, I predict, when John Kerry, former Secretary of State and former Senator, becomes our climate czar. Good thing. We'll get back into the Paris Agreement. And there's one way to cooperate with China. We have to cooperate with China, regardless of their bad behavior on the pandemic. We have to cooperate with China on the pandemic. And then comes harder stuff in the commercial area. But I think that from what I can tell, the Biden team is very talented and can thread a needle here and find a strategy that will be much more effective. China's economy is hurting. There's a huge move of Chinese to the cities. The cities don't have the capacity to deal with this. Xi Jinping is very powerful, but if he can't deliver for his people, he's going to have a lot of trouble. So he's got a domestic problem, and as we do, it seems to me, are wise people out there, one of whom is only 97. His name is on the institute at the Wilson Center. That's called the Kissinger Institute for China and the U.S.
Right.
He started this in terms of cooperation in the early 70s, and he still has great ideas. And he thinks that we need to be tougher and we need to be smarter. And, to quote Martin Luther King in an age of systemic racism, the arc of history bends toward justice. Let's hope the arc of U.S.-China relationship bends toward cooperation and only confrontation where we must.
Well, that's a terrific answer. And as you know, as we've been watching the relationship unfold over the last several years, sometimes it has seemed to be strategyless.
Yeah.
So if the basis of our strategy is be tougher, but also look for opportunity, I think that's a good way to move forward. Now, the United States faces many challenges right now. At the domestic level, they're quite complex. They've been quite persistent. And I think that the coming administration and American leadership in the 21st century domestically has a lot of challenges ahead of it. But we also have a lot of challenges globally as well. Jane, as you look out across the world stage, and as we begin to move deeper into the century, what are going to be some of the greatest challenges, maybe even the single greatest challenge that the United States will face that will demand American leadership as we move forward in this century?
Well, again, I think Joe Biden, who is a very old friend of mine, who came to the Senate when I was a Senate aide in 1973, imagine that, and had just suffered the loss of his wife and his daughter. I mean, it was a tragic, scary time for him, but he pulled himself together. But Biden has articulated 4 priorities that I think are the answer to your question. One is solving the pandemic. 2 is fixing the economy. And it's not just our economy. Our economy is a global economy. So fixing or helping to fix the economy. 3 is climate. And talk about an existential challenge. I come from California, a state that is melting down. I live in a tsunami zone in Venice Beach, literally. That's what the signs all say. And the fires and the floods and the riots, and it's just, the Golden State is a little tarnished. So climate is 3, and 4, which we have to put on the agenda, and which I salute you and the Brookings for focusing on, is systemic racism. It's not just a problem in this country. I mean, the history of slavery is incredibly ugly, but it is a problem worldwide. And again, we have to wrestle our demons. We have to know who we are. We're the United States of America, not the divided states of America. Right. And getting to that will be a huge challenge that we all have to share in solving.
And I think one of the platforms, one of the means by which American leadership will be most on display in the 21st century will be a return to multilateralism. Yes. And you talked about it a little earlier. Let me get your thoughts on this. What does U.S. partnership really mean in the 21st century? In the 20th century, sometimes it looked hegemonic, and sometimes finding the clear partnership and the balance and the equilibrium was difficult. But in the 21st century, where there are peer competitors and enormous economic pressures underway, climate, demographic instability, et cetera, it really demands American partnership in a multilateral way. What does that mean to you, and what should our allies be thinking about in terms of a reliable American partner?
So I can think of a few words that are not flattering about how we have led.
Right.
One is hubris.
Yes.
One is lack of humility. And probably a third is this notion of American exceptionalism, which is true sometimes, but not true all the time. Right. If we could just get over ourselves and realize that we have a lot to make up, a lot of people to learn from, and that as the indispensable partner, we're going to pay our dues and be part of the organizations we're already in, modernize those organizations. Who doesn't think the UN, NATO, pick a few others, need modernizing? The WHO, they all do. But with our help, they could be modernized in a way that wouldn't just help us, but it would, a rising tide lifts all boats, to quote John F. Kennedy, who was the inspiration for my getting into politics. It does. We can do all of those things. And it seems to me starting there with one more thing would be a good way to go. Biden has an excellent team. What could that team do beyond all this? Process, restore process. It's the world's most boring word, but you would know that the late General Brent Scowcroft probably gets the gold star for the best national security advisor in the history of the world. He was a wonderful, humble man who understood that the building blocks of process make for the best decisions. And if this foreign policy team can rebuild process, which is in tatters, and that process can be shared with our partners in these various international organizations, wow. And I'll make one last comment. Woodrow Wilson, who had many flaws, especially in the area of racial justice, was the guy who imagined the League of Nations, which became the UN, which became one among many international organizations. He knew that was the building block for peace. It's still the building block for peace.
That's right. Well, you've mentioned many names this morning, individuals you've pointed to as being exemplars of leadership. We asked you to join us for this conference because you, in fact, are an exemplar of leadership. You've certainly been one for me. And could you give us some of your thoughts? Your personal philosophy is what is at the heart of the leadership that Jane Harman has displayed for all of us for so many years, which has made our country truly a better country. What is your leadership philosophy, Jane?
Well, after I stop crying, let me pull myself together and try to answer that. I was a kid growing up in Los Angeles, public school education until college. And I went to the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960, before most people's great grandparents were born. And I saw the nomination of John F. Kennedy for president. And I was an usher at his acceptance speech. And this whole idea of ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country has motivated me forever, for 150 years, including my long service in Congress. And country first, party second. That's a huge part of what I have always thought was the right thing to do. Secondly, I haven't missed the movie that I am female. When I went to Harvard Law School, there were very few women in the class. I have hysterically funny stories to tell, even as an entering member of Congress. And I am the first woman to lead the Wilson Center. And my comment about leadership by women is, first of all, it's very good. We lead in many ways in our families. It's not something we have to learn later. Women manage households, women manage children, women manage aging parents, and et cetera, et cetera. Women manage difficult husbands sometimes, but not all the time, but that's kind of the idea. So we come with leadership skills, and we know how to compromise, which is now a dirty word, compromise to get results. So we bring good skills. As a woman leader, I have learned a couple things. One, be confident. You have to be confident that you are bringing skills to what you do. Number two, be prepared. Don't whine and cry. Just be the best qualified person in the room. And three, finally, set an example for those who are coming after you. It's a dirty little secret that some women don't help other women. That's not cool. And help other women and try to be a role model. I had many role models who happened to be women, one of whom was Geraldine Ferraro, the late Geraldine Ferraro, who was the first woman nominated to a national party ticket. And when I spoke at her funeral, along with both Clintons, Madeleine Albright, and Fritz Mondale, who had the courage to nominate her as his vice president, I just said, oh my God, I mean, this woman was amazing, and she helped shape my life. So now I'm going to cry again, so I better stop.
Well, she was magnificent, as have been so many of the names you've mentioned, Jane. So as people will watch this conference and they will listen to the words we've spoken, one of the things that we would want to have is that people will have a commitment to learning as a result of what they've heard. So let me just ask a couple of thoughts. Role models for you, those who have had well-documented lives of success in leadership. Can you suggest some of those names for our audience to then pursue the study of their lives as role models? Now, the story of Jane Harman is yet to be completed, but there are many lives out there that have been well-documented. Are there role models that people can be studying where they'll learn the lessons that you've just spoken about and the lessons that will carry American leadership deep into the 21st century as a constructive and, as you said, an indispensable influence on the world stage?
Well, I started with two. I know you won't let me talk about you, so I'm not going to talk about you. But I'll talk about George, who was a great leader, military leader, and our first president, and who walked away from the job and said it's just as important what happens when I leave as what happened when I came. He knew how to leave. Another leader who knew how to leave was Nelson Mandela. And having recently, before the pandemic, been in South Africa with some of my grandchildren, he leaves an astounding legacy there. Sadly, the country is not, in my view, in as good shape as when he left it. But he understood things. He understood how to forgive, and he certainly understood how to wield power in an inclusive way. So I give him enormous credit for that. I mentioned my friend Geraldine Ferraro, who was well prepared, humorous, and gutsy, and I loved it. I just loved it, and I knew her well. And you know, there's some more examples in the Congress now. I'll mention my closest friend in Congress, Susan Collins, who just survived, you know, the existential experience from hell in a very hard election. She's not in my party. She was outspent 4-1. No one thought she'd make it, but she held on and she exhibited grace and grit. And she's now in a position in the United States Senate as a majority maker for either side. And you know, I salute her. Hard work, humility, bipartisanship. So I mean, I could go on, but I'm saying that what I'd love to see is young women, of course I would, develop all those traits. And I will do my best. I try at the Wilson Center, which I'm leaving, by the way, in a couple months. Who knows what's next, but I will try, and I have tried for a decade to help younger women succeed there. And we have a majority female workforce. Oh, by the way, I call that a good
Well, I think we know what's next. Well, I think the women who've been appointed to the next administration, it is an exceptional group of young leaders. And I hope people will be taking pages from their books, their leadership books. And as you say, you're leading leaving the Wilson Center. You're leading it and will be leaving it. But what I do know is that you'll continue to be that leadership exemplar for all of us as you go forward. And we're going to need that. We really are going to need that. So Jane, thank you for joining us today. Brookings and George Washington's Mount Vernon wanted to come together to bring real leadership to this forum to help us all to understand in the difficult era of the 21st century moving forward, what will American leadership really look like? But more importantly, what will it require? And what you have done today is to show us that it requires character and strength and assertiveness and intellect, not because you spoke about them, but because you live them. And I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a wonderful opportunity to see you again. I look forward to seeing you actually at Mount Vernon as soon as we can do that. And that can't come soon enough. Please stay well, stay healthy, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. And thank you for continuing leadership at Brookings and everywhere you go.
Thank you very much.
I've been asked by Mount Vernon to say a few things about Washington's leadership and what light it might shed on the United States in this somewhat troubled time. Washington is generally regarded as primus inter pares, first among equals within the greatest generation of political leadership in America, the founding generation. I think it's fair to say that Benjamin Franklin was wiser. Thomas Jefferson was more intellectually sophisticated. John Adams was more informed historically and better read. James Madison was more politically adroit. Alexander Hamilton was more brilliant. Hamilton would have got the highest grades on the SATs. But all of them agreed that Washington was their superior. What did they mean by that? Well, sometimes they said it very succinctly. They said, Washington always did the right thing rightly. Let's press that. What does that mean? There are 3 chapters in the American founding. When we win our independence, when we move from a confederation to a constitution, and that means to a nation, and when we create a government that consolidates that national power in a way that survives and endures as most young republics don't. Washington was the leading figure in each of the foundings. He was, they all said, the only indispensable man. let's press it a bit further. Washington was trusted with power because he had demonstrated that he was willing to surrender it. He was, as one of his ablest biographers, Gary Wills, put it, an aficionado of exits. We all know how he left the presidency after 2 terms and set the 2-term precedent confirmed by a constitutional amendment in 1951. But the other surrender of power that's more resonant and more relevant is in 1783, when he appears in Annapolis and surrenders his commission and walks away as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army at the end of the war. Present for that was Thomas Jefferson, the representative from Virginia, and he said, and I read this now, the moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of the liberty it was intended to establish. What Jefferson was thinking of was Julius Caesar and Oliver Cromwell, who had retained power in the Roman Republic and in the English Commonwealth. Looking ahead, Napoleon wouldn't do it. Stalin wouldn't do it. Mao wouldn't do it. Castro wouldn't do it. Walk away from power. I think that the point here is that Washington was put together in such a way that he found it impossible to violate his obligation to the public interest. He can't talk to us now, but I will try to channel his wisdom for some final thoughts. Namely, what would he say to us now? I think he would say that we need to create a national service program, a domestic version of the Peace Corps that permits and encourages American youth to experience public service in a way that they have not for quite some time. 2 or 3 generations have grown up since the draft was ended. And the civic sense that he presumed existed in the public has to some extent eroded. I also think that he would expect all high school graduates to be able to pass the civics test that all incoming immigrants must pass for citizenship. Right now, I think less than 30% of them could. And very specifically, in our coronavirus crisis, I think Washington would say citizenship provides rights and obligations. And we all have an obligation to others, and that means we should all be wearing masks in public places. A simple message, but at this moment, I think one that I'm sure he would concur with. Thank you.
Hello, my name is John Slavic. I'm the CEO and founder of Slavic 401k. We are pleased to have a long association with Mount Vernon and the principles that Mount Vernon embodies for our country. I'm grateful to the leadership at Mount Vernon for sponsoring such an important conference at this time in our nation's history. Thank you, too, to many people who are taking part in the conference that will give us insight and direction in the days to come. I'm particularly grateful for the example of George Washington himself, who embodied, first of all, personal responsibility. As the father and founder of the United States of America, his example has been set now for centuries, for generations to follow in terms of personal responsibility. Secondly, his character. His character was above reproach in almost every respect, both as a living man and then long after his death. It's at a time when character needs to resound through the halls of leadership within our country today. And so the strength of his character stands as a great example for us all. And then finally, accountability. Accountability is where each of us take not only our personal responsibility, but to look to hold accountable those around us, especially in positions of leadership. So we look forward to the outcome of this conference. We look forward to 2021 having endured the perils of 2020 and a pandemic, and look forward to a new day here in the United States, where the leadership of General Washington, as exemplified in Mount Vernon, show themselves powerfully as an example to the rest of the world. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Joining us for this segment of A More Perfect Union, the Conference on American Leadership in the 21st Century, sponsored jointly by the Brookings Institution and George Washington's Mount Vernon. Today, we're going to talk about corporate leadership, the private sector leadership that'll be so helpful to American leadership more broadly in the 21st century. And we couldn't be more fortunate than to have the president of Microsoft joining us today, Brad Smith. Brad leads 1,500 business, legal, corporate affairs professionals located in 54 countries, but operating in more than 120 nations. At Microsoft, he plays a key role in spearheading the company's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society. A native of Wisconsin, Brad is a graduate of Princeton University and received his JD from Columbia University Law School. And over the past decade, Brad has spearheaded the company's work to advance privacy protection for Microsoft customers, the rights of dreamers, and other immigrants, including bringing multiple lawsuits against the US government on these issues. And bravo, Brad. Thank you for doing that. Now, in the time I've known Brad, I've always valued his insight on the responsibility of the private sector to preserve and promote civil society. Brad is uniquely qualified to speak about the types of values-based, principled leadership, not just at the corporate level, but at the personal level, that will be necessary for American leadership in the 21st century. So we're so grateful to have you with us today, Brad, and I can't thank you enough personally.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to be with you and with both Brookings and Mount Vernon, two great institutions. So it's a pleasure, and it's a great topic to discuss. I look forward to it.
Well, we will benefit certainly from your views on these many issues that we'll be facing. So George Washington, General Washington, and then President Washington spoke often of citizens throughout all of society being fully involved in the democratic process. Now, many companies, Microsoft included, have played incredibly powerful roles in creating new sectors of the economy, millions of jobs, and extraordinary wealth. Brad, what is the national obligation, the kind of responsibility that an organization like Microsoft has that comes with that kind of impact and success in society?
Well, first, I just have to say I can't help but think about how we ground ourselves in this topic by thinking back to George Washington himself, because I think he was the first American leader to really have to come to terms and then ultimately embrace the role of people that went beyond the government itself. When you read about the history of his experiences, he started in 1775 with great skepticism about these militia that were raised in different communities. They weren't as disciplined. He didn't think that they would be as helpful as the regular army. Right. And by the time the war ended, he actually found that they arguably were one of the great strategic differentiators that led to the founding of our country. And there's something that I do think speaks to us today in two very powerful ways, all through the decades and centuries since. One is the government cannot necessarily solve every problem by itself and needs the agility to expand and call on additional resources that can be harnessed quickly. That was as important in World War II as it was in the war for our nation's independence. But second, it only works if those of us in the private sector bring a public spirit to our work. I always like to say you don't need to work for the public sector to engage in public service. Right. And I think each of us has a responsibility. And that's been part of this almost unique culture of the United States. And now here we are in the 2020s, a new generation of challenges. But in some ways an age-old answer in part to help us meet them.
Well, that's a great platform for the next question, which is how does the private sector engage in solving some of the biggest questions that we face as a nation today and in the world? The environment, global health, immigration. What's the role of the private sector in helping us to solve those challenges?
I would say two things. First, I think you always need role clarity to do anything important in life that involves lots of people. So in the first instance, I do believe that the public and private sectors have distinct roles. And, in a democracy, to address public challenges, we quite rightly look to the government to lead. And to make decisions by people who are elected by the citizens and to act pursuant to the rule of law that applies to all of us. Now, within that framework, I do believe that there are important contributions for the private sector to make. And I think that the answer for each of us in the private sector is to, again, search for role clarity by asking ourselves, what is it that we uniquely can do? And different industries will answer that question in different ways, different companies and different individuals. But certainly when I look at the technology issues of our day, there is no doubt in my mind that when it comes to things like cybersecurity and privacy or just spreading digital skills and broadband, we have a unique contribution to make. And what is most important is that we proactively engage to be part of the solution to these problems.
So in that context, how does the success of the private sector translate into increasing government effectiveness and overall good governance? And are there efficiencies or are there approaches found in the private sector that can be translated to the bureaucracy that government must have in order to be effective?
I think that there are so many problems that benefit from our sitting down together and asking ourselves what we can do. I'll just make it very concrete. There are two big problems I've been spending my time on this month. One is cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And it's so clear that when we think about cybersecurity, the tech sector has almost a first line of responsibility to defend the nation because we defend so much of the critical infrastructure on which the nation relies. And then we need to do that in support of and in partnership with government. But then I'll go to a very different example, my meetings today. I think that we have discovered that in some ways, it was actually easier to invent a vaccine than it is to distribute it. And there's actually good reason for that. This distribution is an enormously complicated logistical challenge in a country that typically relies on the free market to distribute goods and services, not the government itself. And so, we ask ourselves, well, my goodness, how do we get all these vaccines to the people that need it? Well, it turns out you need a technology platform to connect the people and the processes together. You need to ask, I think, as we're asking ourselves today, are there gaps that we can help fill? Are there, we have employees that we can send over to help with data entry? Are there facilities that we can make available? Can we bring our sophisticated efforts around business process simplification every day, to work that badly needs it? And so I'm never going to be one who says, just let the market solve these problems. I think we need this partnership and we need a regulated market. But I also think that for those who sometimes think, let's just leave businesses out of this, let's not look to the market, that I think would fall short of the full capabilities that we need to harness to address these great problems.
Well, you hit an important point, and these, just the nature of the logistics alone for, as we say, getting vaccine into arms, you almost can't overstate the complexity of that. But it is solvable, and I think we're taking steps to make that happen. So in that context, how can major philanthropic entities in the midst of worldwide intense political differences make a difference on things like global health issues, just COVID-19, both in the United States, domestically, but internationally as well? Can an organization in the private sector, Microsoft, your leadership, can that help to forge collaboration at the national level between cities and states and the national government, but even more so between countries as we try to solve this enormous public health issue?
I hope so. I think the answer needs to be yes. I think one of the interesting things about the problems of the world is that many of them don't stop at a nation's borders. Virus doesn't respect borders. Carbon does not either, as it spreads through the atmosphere. Now, interestingly, governments actually stop at a nation's borders. So part of what we need to do to solve problems is work together in more of a multilateral framework than we have, say, the past 4 years. But then you think about the role of private institutions, whether they be companies or other institutions like the Brookings Institution or large philanthropic organizations. We tend to operate with a global reach, and that's a great asset. And so I always like to think about 3 areas in which we can contribute. First, it's what we can do. So if there's a technology solution, we can contribute it, and we can contribute it on an international basis. Second, there's the power not just of what we do, but what we might say, the use of our voice. And we always need to be thoughtful. We need to be appropriate. But I sometimes think we have useful things to say, and we can lend our voice to support these causes, whether it's the Paris Accord for climate, or NATO and its strength as an organization, or a plethora of other issues. And then finally, interestingly, I think the least appreciated aspect of what private institutions can contribute based on our global reach is what we know. Every single day, we're connected with people around the world. Your introduction referred to the fact that I have a team in 54 countries. I have this wonderful listening system that is telling me how different governments and philanthropic groups and companies are thinking about all of these issues. And so I sometimes find that one of the most useful things we can do is just share what we're hearing through our listening systems, and then be part of the team. And like I say, I think it's a team typically that is led by government, but has civil society, non-governmental organizations, and companies. And when we work together in this sort of multi-stakeholder manner, my gosh, that's when you can actually help solve some problems.
That's a great answer. And in particular, with respect to your leadership personally, but Microsoft's leadership more broadly, as we have seen the tech industry, private sector, but the tech industry in particular, grow in importance, grow in reach, and you talked about what ends at a national border and what doesn't, grow in international influence, crossing borders. There is a real role here, potentially, as we go forward in the 21st century, especially with emerging powers, for organizations like yours and leadership like yours personally, Brad, to play an important role in helping us with our international relationships. Could we take just a moment and talk about 2 things? One is how you see the relationship perhaps with the U.S. and China going forward. I think we're on the verge of a very interesting moment going forward with the relationship. And more broadly, and I think very importantly, the role of tech writ large, but Microsoft in particular, in the community of democracies going forward, and the system of government that we treasure so much as a democracy and the rule of law. Where is Microsoft in international relations, but also preserving democracy?
Well, when we start, let's say, with the U.S. and China, the Pacific is the widest ocean, and in geopolitical terms, it seems to be getting wider still. And I do think it's just fair to acknowledge that the U.S. And Chinese governments have very different worldviews and just very different systems of government and values and even philosophical traditions. I do think we're in an era of strategic competition, and I don't think that's going to end. And I think that's going to have a lot of implications for a great many questions. At the same time, I don't think that we can really afford to allow a divide to become a complete rupture. We need to have a dialogue that spans the Pacific and brings together the rest of the world. We need to identify where we can, and indeed, I would even say must work together, with climate being at the top of the list. And even on issues of technology, where you're seeing two spheres almost, there, I believe, will be a need for some level of interoperability, and at times for technology to move across the Pacific, but with the kinds of controls that will ensure trust. All of that is a long way of saying this is complicated, and it is going to take not just thoughtfulness, but people of goodwill who can sit down and talk it through to fashion a path forward. But the other part of it is, I think, quite rightly connected, as you did, John. This is a time, I believe, to call on the world's democracies to work more closely together. I always look forward every January to the Economist Intelligence Unit's annual review of the state of democracy around the world. In recent years, it's tended to show that roughly 47% of the world's population, 3.7 billion people, live in about 75 democratic nations. We have more in common. In fact, we have more common cause, I would argue, than perhaps we have had in quite a long time. And I'm very optimistic that the Biden administration recognizes this, will provide renewed leadership that the world wants from us, and I think we should be hard-headed. It's going to take a lot of work to rebuild confidence in the United States. It's going to take determination over time. And I will hasten to add, it will need more than leadership by people in government alone. Even in the last 4 years, when the government retreated, those of us in the private sector leaned in. And I think for those of us in the tech sector especially, it is a powerful reminder of both the opportunity we have to contribute, but this enormous responsibility I believe we have to win trust ourselves, to build guardrails around technology, and to do more to address the concerns that people have oftentimes about technology itself.
Well, as we face 2021, it's just recently, within the last few days, where the first indicators came to us about COVID. In less than a year, we have suffered hundreds of thousands of dead, millions infected, the near tanking of our economy, separately but related, a national reckoning on race and equity and social justice, the very clear indicators that there is a climate crisis right on the horizon, and then, of course, the whole issue of the presidential election, which has played out very poignantly in just the last 24 hours of our conversation. Another great president, Abraham Lincoln, talked about the binding up of the nation's wounds. Now, an organization like Microsoft, an organization out of the tech sector, they have a unique opportunity now to help us to bind up the nation's wounds. How would you see that going forward, Brad?
Well, I want us to do what we can, because I think we should. And I just think part of what we need to recognize is the need to build a brighter future for racial minorities in urban centers and rural white citizens as well. We need to think about the country as a whole. And I think it often needs to begin by listening to different people, understanding their problems, frankly, just acknowledging our belief in their importance. One of the great things I've always loved about the foundation that Bill and Melinda Gates founded after leaving Microsoft, but obviously with the foundation of success that Microsoft itself created, was this very simple principle: every life is of equal value. And I just think so often in our country today, people don't feel that they are regarded as being equally appreciated by someone else. So I hope we can all show greater appreciation. It's a time to remember that the enemy is a virus, not each other. and then take steps in a very tangible way to give people what they need for greater success. For somebody like me, I look at it and say, we need to bring broadband to every rural farm in this country, and we need to make broadband affordable for every family in urban America. We need to provide access to digital skills for everyone. We need to protect people's rights and use data as one of the means that can create greater confidence in our law enforcement officers and what they do and how they do it across the country. There's always a little bit of a danger, obviously, that if I'm a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I will say this, there are a lot of problems that have technology as a piece of the solution. And if we in the tech sector can recognize that opportunity to be a part of a broader team and serve the entire country, I think that will at least be a part, maybe just a small part, but a part of what would help the country heal.
Well, to that point, 21st century is rushing at us in a very big way. Many challenges, but also many opportunities.
Well, interestingly, John, I think there are so often opposite sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just pick on one that scholars at the Brookings Institution have been focused on, and some of what we follow is data that has come out of your scholars' studies. We know that jobs in this country are becoming more digital in their content because your scholars have documented it. We know that jobs that have more digital content pay more money than jobs that do not. And we know that COVID-19 is rapidly accelerating all of this. So as we look to 2021 and 2022, some of the jobs that are created will be different from those that were displaced. We're going to need to train people with more digital skills. And there are a couple of things that I think are particularly interesting to think about in this regard. Between 1980 and the year 2000, employers, private sector employers and public sector employers, invested in more and more training of their workforce, of their employees. But that hit a peak in about the year 2000. I think that was the point when everybody recognized that people likely were able to come to work knowing how to use a computer, or they could go watch a YouTube video if they did not. And the employers didn't need to provide that training. So we saw employer investments in employee training first drop for a decade and then stagnate for a decade. We need a reinvestment in the training of our people. And this is at every level, from grade school to universities to lifelong learning for people who have jobs and people who do not. It should call on all of us. We know that technology tools and services like LinkedIn that Microsoft owns will be part of it. This should be a moment when private sector employers ask themselves, what can all of us do to invest in our people? And for us at Microsoft, how can we provide the technology to make that easier? I think it is a time for government to ask as well, especially, I will say, for the small business sector. As we think about stimulating the economy, I happen to believe that one of the great short and long-term benefits is to reduce the barriers of entry for people getting new jobs by, say, providing tax credits to small businesses to invest in training and onboarding, the skilling, so that people have a brighter future. Other countries around the world are doing this. We shouldn't be a laggard. We should be a leader. So that's just one issue that sort of connects everything we're talking about here, all of the different parts of society that can contribute. I think the need for new ideas and for leadership by the government itself.
Well, Brad, thank you so much for joining us today. If there was one common thread in your answer, the answers to those really important questions, it was that people matter. And that they are important not just to your organization, Microsoft, they're very important to you, and they should be important to us. And thank you for that. Thank you for that inspiring message. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your humanity. And we couldn't be happier than that you were able to join us today in a conference that wanted to talk about American leadership in the 21st century to make a more perfect union. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And just to close where I began, one of the things I appreciate about this topic is oftentimes people who say are more conservative or skeptical about the role of government, and sometimes people who are more liberal are more skeptical about the role of business. Well, George Washington began that war with great skepticism about what people who were not employed in the regular army could contribute. And what he learned, what won this nation's independence, was literally the ability to bring people together and solve problems with creativity about what each of us could do if we work together in new ways. This is a good time, not just to virtually connect with Mount Vernon, but I think also intellectually, perhaps build on an idea that was born there.
Couldn't be better said. Thank you so much for joining us today and for participating in this conference to make a more perfect union. Thank you, Brad. Good.
Thank you.
Well, Senator Kane, welcome to Mount Vernon.
Doug, it's great to be back with you. I wish I was in person, as I have been many times, but I'm glad to be doing this discussion with you virtually today and look forward to being at Mount Vernon soon.
Well, so the idea of the conference is called Leadership for a More Perfect Union. And General John Allen and I were talking about America in crisis. We're facing some tremendous problems with the pandemic, with social issues, with economic disruption, and lack of political trust. And we talked about the importance of leadership in these times. So, and service. If you don't mind, if you could tell us first, Senator, why did you decide a career in public service was for you?
Doug, it was, a little bit accidental. I've had kind of an accidental political career. I was a missionary in Honduras for a year in the middle of law school, and that made me decide I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer to help the least of these, basically. So I moved to Richmond, married a wonderful Virginian, my wife, Ann. I worked as a civil rights lawyer for 17 years, but I got mad at my city council one day because it was too racially divided on issues of controversy. White members would vote one way, African-American members would vote the other way. And I thought, I was a naive young person. I thought I could be a good bridge builder. And that got me into politics. And it was at the local level and, building schools, filling potholes, fighting crime. I loved it. I then was on my way out of politics after my second term as mayor. And a friend who was running for lieutenant governor announced she couldn't because she had pancreatic cancer. So I thought about it. Life is often just these weird things that happen, sometimes good, sometimes bad, that push you in directions you didn't know you would go. I opened up chapter 2. I then served as lieutenant governor and governor. And then I was on my way out of politics again. And President Obama asked if I would be chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He and I were close. That then led into me running for the Senate. So I never intended to go into politics. I was on my way out of politics twice, but my Honduras experience made me put me on a spiritual journey of just trying to help other people in a simple way. And it's developed into this now 27-year career of being in elected office. And I'm so glad that I went down a path that I didn't initially see for myself.
Well, I'm delighted you did as well. Thank you for your service. You have stumbled into, in your political career, some of the storied seats of American political leadership. I mean, you are in the Senate. I think you're in Monroe's seat, Senator Monroe's seat, Virginia. And of course, as governor of Virginia, you're in the seat of Jefferson and Patrick Henry and many other great governors from our early history. What, how does history, for you as a Virginian, in this role, how does it play into the way you think about your job?
Doug, I'm a huge reader of history and really try to extract the lessons of it. I love a Harry Truman quote, "The only thing new under the sun is the history you don't know." So much of life gets illuminated by historical trends. So I guess I would say the way that the history most informs my mission is a belief that our America began with a promise we made about ourselves that wasn't true when we made it, but that still was a good promise that all are created equal. Jefferson articulated that in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is viewed as the founder of the Democratic Party, the oldest political party in the world. He put that in the Declaration as one of a number of self-evident truths, plural. But at Gettysburg, Lincoln, who founded the Republican Party, boiled it down to one proposition, a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So I sort of view the American story as we set a goal out before ourselves. It was a perfect goal. We're imperfect people. It's sort of like a North Star that a sailor can orient by without ever reaching it, but it's good to orient by it. And when we do, we progressively get closer to who we said we would be. And of course, we're imperfect. So then we drift away from it. And then problems are caused and there's challenges. I loved in the inauguration the other day, the young Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate, said, "We're not a broken nation, simply an unfinished one." We're on a journey. And the journey has many, many miles to go. But when we orient right, we become more like who we said we would be. And that's sort of my view of our history and how it informs the work that I've tried to do as a civil rights lawyer and as an elected official.
Well, you express it in an inspiring way and I think speaks to a lot of what Americans believe across both parties and independents. But you brought up this word naive earlier. As you launched your career, thinking you could help things work better in Richmond. And then you did, right? I mean, it was naive, but it got you in there and it got you going. So how can naivete still help you now that you're a grizzled old veteran of the battles as we try to confront these huge crises the country's facing?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think without naivete, most of the good work in the world wouldn't get done. My mother always told me, Tim, you have to make a decision in life. If you want to be right, be a pessimist, but if you want to do right, be an optimist. So there's also a willed element of, are you going to be an optimist or pessimist? I think I continually run up against recognition of my own naivete. I remember one of my first awakenings in the Senate was when we passed comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, nearly 70 votes, very bipartisan. I worked real hard on it. And we got it done in the Senate, and it was going over to a Republican House. I knew they wouldn't just adopt our bill, but I thought for sure they would do their own version, and then we'd get in conference and hammer it out together. Instead, they never took the bill up, either ours or their own, in committee for years, and I was like sort of shocked. So I continued to run up against my own over-optimism, my own naivete. But I do think, it's very important to approach the world. There's biblical invocations to suffer the little children unto me and behave like a child. There's a wonderful Karl Marx quote of all people: "A man cannot become a child again lest he become childish, but should he not take pleasure in a child's naivete and seek to emulate its truth at a higher level?" We have to shed our cynicism and the scar tissue that life gives us and approach things fresh. And when we do, we're more creative and we're more likely to get results.
Yeah, I love it, and it sounds great. But the reality is, we're facing right now, we're going to see another 100,000 deaths in the next 20 days from this pandemic. It's going to get worse in the short term, and then we have to see great leadership beyond the pandemic. How do we start to repair, the nation, a lot of the challenges that have been revealed really during this year. So what are some of your goals as a leader in the Senate to try to help solve problems this year?
Well, Doug, you're kind to call me a leader in the Senate, and I want to tell you, I'm not in leadership, not in Democratic leadership, and I'm not a committee chair. I chair two subcommittees, one in armed services, one in foreign relations. But I've decided that my leadership role in the Senate is to be a bridge builder with Republican colleagues, and so that's going to be my charism, is what the Catholics might call it, my unique gift I can bring, having been a civil rights lawyer and built bridges over racial divides in my own city. I hope I can do the same, and I've tried to do that in the Senate. So I think the immediate priorities that we have before us are, first, we're talking just days after the inauguration, you and I, we've got to get the Biden leadership team in place. Many of our federal agencies cabinet departments have been sort of hollowed out at the top. We got to put a team in place because there's so many big issues on the table. We need competent managers addressing them. But then second, I think we still have to demonstrate to the American public, well, you talked about the death toll from COVID, that we recognize their suffering. There's a health suffering, there's a mental health suffering, there's an economic suffering. We have to recognize that suffering and then come together to address it. And there are many aspects of that, whether it's economic support, unemployment insurance, whether it's, really accelerating a deployment of the vaccine that reaches into every corner, not just metropolitan America, or not just blue states, or not just people with the money to afford the vaccine. We've got to show we can do that. And I think if we can come together, trust and bipartisanship is a set of steps, not just one giant leap. If we can come together early in this new administration and deliver some relief that shows Americans, Congress is listening, Congress is trying to act. Obviously, we've done a lot already in 2020, but we want to do more. We can start to earn some trust. And, bipartisanship is a little bit like a muscle. If you exercise it, it gets stronger. If you don't, it gets weaker. So if we can make some headway early in dealing with COVID, it may build momentum for more, bipartisanship on things like immigration reform for the first time since 1986, or meaningfully addressing gun safety consistent with the Second Amendment. There's a lot of challenges before us.
Well, I love, though, that spirit of can-doism that comes through when you talk about this. And I reflect in history of Lyndon Johnson's presidency as someone who was a creature of the Senate, like President Biden is a creature of the Senate. I mean, in the best possible way. He knew how to get things done in a very divided time in America's history, at a time when people thought the Senate was a completely broken and failed institution in the late 50s and 60s. And the extraordinary legislation that he was able to get through, even, at a time of a very divided Senate. So, hope can spring eternal here. Do you think Biden's history as a senator will guide him a little bit?
I really do, Doug, and I'm glad you put your finger on that. Not since LBJ have we had a president who had as much experience in the Senate and loved the Senate as much as Joe Biden does. I mean, he loves the Senate, Judiciary Committee, Foreign Relations Committee. Many of the senators are people who've worked closely with Joe Biden. I'd never served in the Senate with him, but I know him very well because my first 4 years in the Senate, he was vice president. We worked on a lot of items together. What I notice in my colleagues is there's no edge as they talk about Joe Biden. So the Republican senators, if I heard them talk about Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, there's often an edge in their words, but that's not the case with Joe. They may not agree with him on this or that, or if he says a gaffe, they may joke about it, but there's an affection, and they recognize him as a good man. And so that mutual regard does not immediately transform policy disagreements into, agreements, but it does open up opportunities to listen and dialogue and find the middle ground. And if we can't do all that I want, how about this portion that we should agree with? And I can see in his opening plan about dealing with COVID, Republicans want to accelerate vaccine deployment in their states. Republicans realize that we've got to have better broadband in rural America, because what we've learned during the pandemic is, hey, telehealth is great. Teleeducation is fine. It's great to visit with family members by Zoom, but you can only do it if you've got good broadband, and so much of rural America, red America, is left out of it. So I do see areas of significant potential cooperation, and I think Biden will prioritize that in a good way.
Well, Biden's inaugural was lovely, intoning on unity. For my taste, not enough quotes from George Washington, who, of course, was the original unifier and who stood above party. As much as us Virginians love our Thomas Jefferson, it was Washington that they all looked up to. So, Washington's farewell address, I want to talk about it in two contexts.
Good.
First, in this context of, a partisan spirit and the danger of partisan spirit. And then also about America's place in the world. And I know that you're obviously heavily involved in that. So let's start, we'll stay on this partisan line. Washington struggled in his own time with party spirit sort of getting out of control, and he talked about the danger of one party coming in and taking vengeance on another party who comes in then and take vengeance. And from my point of view, we've seen a lot of this, really going back to the 90s since the wall fell, where you had, Congress going from one party to the other and then getting voted out after 2 years. And how can we break that cycle and recognize that compromise is a value as well as a tactic?
Well, I will say you're right. We didn't hear words of Washington in the inaugural, but the Washington farewell address is the only speech that's read every year in Congress on or around Washington's birthday. And every year, and it goes back, that tradition goes back a very long time. And the reader alternates between a Democrat and Republican, and it's a very powerful speech. I think Washington, Washington was probably healthily naive about some things, because as he was decrying partisanship, you also had the architects of the Constitution basically understanding human motivations and writing in the Federalist Papers, well, the way to deal with human ambition is to check it off against itself. The checks and balances notion, the Hamilton and Madison and John Jay, I think they understood the human tendencies, ambition, or legitimate differences of opinion, and then how that needed to be set off against each other to try to diffuse power and not let power grow into an authoritarian, monolith on one side or the other. But Washington was above that, and maybe a little pleasantly naive. I think there are things we can do that are formal in the Senate to try to bring about more harmony. And in fact, as you know, the design of the Senate does this. We've just recently come through this very challenging attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Remember this, in the House, more than half of the Republicans in the House voted to overturn Electoral College results from Pennsylvania and Arizona. In the Senate, 8 out of 51 Republicans, so 15% of Republicans. So what explains the difference between only 15% of Senate Republicans trying to overturn objections where more than half of House Republicans? When you respond to a statewide electorate, it has a more naturally moderating effect than if you represent a gerrymandered House district. So the Senate is set up in a way where we should be able to take the bigger perspective, step back from the partisanship. I'm hoping that's the case. We haven't gotten a good grade on that recently, at least on big items we haven't. But again, I'm not a pessimist about going forward. So there's some formal things we can do in rules. But John Warner told me when I ran for the Senate, he said, look, anything wrong in the Senate, it's not sick building syndrome. It's not in the water supply. It's in the attitudes of the people who walk into the building every day. And so you should walk into the building every day with a commitment to do, your best to make it work better.
Oh, I'm a big fan of John's, and he's doing well as well, though, he's getting up there, but a great leader himself.
Indeed. I really model, I want to be humble about the way I say this. I view him as a role model. I wouldn't claim his mantle because I don't think anybody can, but I view him as a role model.
Well, I'm sure he knows that, and he loves it as well. So Washington's farewell address also talks about America's place in the world in ways that, in some ways, are really out of date, because at the time the country was a tiny, barely new, struggling country with no military power to speak of, no real place in the world of European diplomacy, which dominated his perspective. And he wanted America to stay out of entangling alliances, which is a Jeffersonian phrase. But at any rate, America now has a very different place in the world as a superpower. You are on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and so how do you think America's role in the world needs to function? And where are we trying to go? With you, if you were all of a sudden in charge of America in the world, where would you try to steer us?
Well, first about Washington, you're right. That aspect of the speech to avoid permanent alliances or permanent enemies was a very powerful one, and it's one of two, good faith American foreign policy traditions. I would say it's the Washington tradition is one, and the Teddy Roosevelt tradition. You know, when Teddy Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy, we grew the Navy into the biggest in the world and probably became the most powerful military in the world. And then Roosevelt also got the Nobel Prize for helping broker the peace deal that ended the Russo-Japanese War. So that was the emergence of the U.S. as global military power, global peacemaking power, largest economy in the world, all happened 1890 to the end of the Teddy Roosevelt term. So we kind of alternate between these poles. What's the right strategy for a Joe Biden, a Biden administration, or in my own view on the Foreign Relations Committee? You know, the world does work better for America and for others when the U.S. is deeply engaged in global efforts, World Health Organization, Paris Climate Accord, which President Biden has rejoined. The big problems of our planet are not problems that know borders. So coronavirus, refugee issues, climate change, there are big problems that can't be solved with robust assertions of sovereignty of 170 nations. There has to be a cooperative spirit. Look at how we use space these days for telecommunications, not just defense, but exploration, radio satellites. Well, not everyone can put everything up in space without it running into each other, unless there's some cooperation to figure out how to do that. So
yeah, I couldn't find a parking lot in DC without a satellite. So,
exactly, right?
Yeah.
so there has to be significant global cooperation, and it frankly works better for the U.S. and for the world when the U.S. is deeply engaged in it. I think where we sometimes blunder, and it would be a blunder that Washington would immediately recognize and warn us against, is sort of too much patting ourselves on the back, the notion of American exceptionalism, the notion of America as the indispensable nation. That can kind of grate against other countries who feel good about themselves. They love the U.S., they want us involved, but it doesn't necessarily make them feel warm and fuzzy when we go around telling everybody that we're better than everyone else. I've always said, instead of being indispensable, let's try to be exemplary, living up to the promises we make about ourselves, like the equality promise. And you know what? If we try to be exemplary, we're more likely to be indispensable than if we try to be indispensable. And that is a way of projecting power by example. As Joe Biden says, the issue should not be the example of American power, but the power of the American example. If we just live up to our own values, the equality principle, opportunity, innovation and creativity, the freedoms of religion and speech and belief and peaceful assembly. So many people around the world don't live in those societies. I lived in a military dictatorship in Honduras where people would have yearned for the freedoms that we had in the United States. So if we just double down on what we've promised about ourselves, that's probably the best way to have outsized influence in a very complicated world.
So I love that idea and that thought. And I think it's also the secret to American unity, because it's the values that we share that make us the people we are. Here at Mount Vernon, of course, we teach people. We teach them about the founding. We teach them the history of the nation, particularly through the perspective and the story of George Washington. And you just mentioned the military dictatorship in Honduras. They had a written constitution that looked a lot like the U.S. Constitution, but what they didn't have was a tradition of civilian control of the military that goes back to the stories of Washington and many others since then.
Yes.
We have to teach these stories, right? I mean, people have to know them. And so I think, we've seen just since the last election how easy it is for these norms, once they're dismissed, like acknowledging that you've lost an election, can scratch the thin veneer of our civic religion here. And so what role do you see, education, civics, and history to teach these values that we share, that come from our founding and have persisted and been fought over throughout our history? What role does the federal government have in that at all?
Doug, you ask a really important question, and Mount Vernon is on the leading edge of this. But I think what we saw in the violent attack on the Capitol was a real failure of education and civics. And I read a very prescient quote of Ulysses Grant's from 1875, 10 years after the Civil War ended. At the end of his second term as president, he was speaking to a group of Civil War veterans in Des Moines. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but he basically said, look, if there's going to be another war like the one we just went through, the dividing line won't be Mason and Dixon's dividing line. It will be a division between patriotism, intelligence, and ambition, superstition, and ignorance. And you know what? The purpose of that speech was to promote education as the antidote to superstition and ignorance.
Right.
But sadly, an awful lot of the people who engaged in the big lie that the election was stolen or that it was rigged or there was fraud were not uneducated people. They were very educated people. Some were ambitious people who were perpetrating a big lie for their own ends. But sadly, some trained military members, trained members of law enforcement, and others were educated, but they were gullible, and they fell easy prey. They were marks to ambitious leaders preaching the big lie. And so, how do we equip people in our education system to understand the value of our traditions, peaceful transfer of power, but also to be critical thinkers, so they can separate out the dross from the gold and understand what's true and what they should be wary of. I think there were some in that attack when we were in the chambers who were violent. There were some who were racist and neo-Nazi and neo-Confederate, but there were many who weren't violent and they weren't racist, but they were deeply gullible. And that should challenge us as educators, whether it's at Mount Vernon or I'm on the education committee too. Health, education, labor, pension needs to challenge us to figure out how to transmit the important reasons for our institutions in a more not skin deep, but surface penetrating way.
Yeah, I mean, both of your last two responses keep bringing to mind, on the one hand, America we need to lead by example and also be there when we're needed, but not do it in such a way that's arrogant. And this other thing about we have to recognize the complete failure that we've done. I mean, we need a lot of humility, it seems to me, as we approach both of these issues, that we're clearly not educating people as well as we think we should be, and or very least we're not helping them continue that education throughout their lives. It isn't just what you do K through 12; it's what you do afterward as well that matters, and what you hear, and how these institutions are talked about, and what our leaders in public service demand of each other.
I think the humility word is very important. As a member of Foreign Relations, we had the confirmation hearing for Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and his predecessor had said the key was swagger. And Tony Blinken said the key was humility and confidence. Humility about ourselves, but confidence that small d democracy is in fact the right path. And even as grim as January 6th was, and American adversaries around the world surely were gloating in it, January 20, where there then was a transfer of power, our adversaries around the world who hold on to it as long as they can, president for life or extending their term or jailing the press or whatever, they probably saw that and were frightened by it, because even in the aftermath of this grim January 6th, we could still deliver. And so we could be humble about ourselves, but confident in our values, confident in the virtues of small d democracy. And we're not broken, we're unfinished.
I love it. I mean, humility is a powerful leadership value. It isn't weak. It isn't passive. It's about being able to listen and then having good judgment. And that was how Washington deployed it. It was his most powerful leadership talent, I think, was his humility. But this is wonderful. And I do want to say, it wasn't just January 20th that the rest of the world hopefully saw, but the work that you did on January 6th. The Senate and the House came back and did your duty and finished the job. I mean, that was as important as what happened on the 20th, I think.
And Doug, I'll say about that, it was really interesting. We were escorted into a hearing room in the Hart Building that had been outfitted for us to do our work in case.
Right.
And so it was ready, and we could have gotten in there and just plowed through the rest of the day's debate. But it was really interesting. 100 of us were in there. And nobody even had to look at each other and talk about it. When somebody at the front, like the sergeant at arms, said, you know, we can work in here and complete the work, everybody just said, no, we're not doing it in here. We're you know, please clear out the chamber. We don't care how long it takes, but we're going back in the chamber and we're going to finish. And it was as if every one of the 100 had exactly the same thought at exactly the same second and articulated it. We knew that what we needed to do was be back in full view of the American public to complete the task that was set before us. And I was very proud of my colleagues. That was a unifying moment. I was very proud of them in that moment.
Yeah, and I was proud to be an American in that moment as well. And to thank you for your service again. You know, I think we'll wrap up, but you know, final thoughts, if you have any, on this challenging year. You know, I would say you've got support here from Mount Vernon. Anytime you want to bring folks out and get them inspired to think about, you know, what we can do as a nation and what we've failed to do, we're happy to help. But what, you know, where do you, how do you get yourself up every day and try to take on these massive problems?
Well, I will acknowledge you, Doug. It's been a challenging year. I mean, when we finished 2019, the Senate chaplain, I go to a bipartisan prayer breakfast every Wednesday morning. And the Senate chaplain in December 2019 said, okay, this is the last prayer breakfast of the decade. And it got me thinking about the decade of 2000 to January 1, 2020. And I realized virtually nothing that I would have predicted in 2010 would have come out the same way. In fact, I wouldn't have ever guessed I'd have been in the Senate. I wouldn't have guessed I would have had a son in the Marine Corps. I wouldn't have guessed I'd been on a national ticket. I got a daughter who's an actress. I got a son who's a visual artist. I wouldn't have guessed that Donald Trump would be president. I wouldn't have guessed that Democrats would be sweeping state offices in Virginia. I would have gotten everything wrong. And so I remember thinking in January of 2020, gosh, I wonder if there'll be any surprises this year. Impeachment, pandemic, a contested election, a violent attack on the Capitol. Man, it's just so your question is, how do you you know, get up and go every day? Well, you know, I do think this notion of sort of a willed optimism, humility about ourselves, and humility, I heard somebody describe it as humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And so humility about ourselves, but confidence in our values. One of my other favorite presidents, Harry Truman, just had a belief: if my motives are pure and I pick good people and I work very hard, then more often than not, it's going to work out better. Not all the time, but more often than not, it's going to work out better. And just that simple faith in our values and in the capacity of people well-motivated, working hard to achieve things that are greater than themselves. I believe it because the evidence tells me that that's right.
Well, and that belief is what got you in the work you're in. So, you know, congratulations, keep going and keep your chin up, and we'll all together pull together and get this done, I think. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks so much for Mount Vernon's important work in telling a story of a person that values in the abstract are hard to grasp, but when they're centered in the life of a person, they're much easier for people to absorb. So the work that you do to use the exemplary, complicated, interesting George Washington to center these values is so important, and I look forward to joining you at Mount Vernon soon.
Thank you very much.